Welcome to Mysterious Goings On. We're going to get right to the show after these messages.
Hi, I'm Dr. Ehrlich, author of Christian Minimalism, Simple Steps for Abundant Living, and you're listening to the Mysterious Goings On podcast.
There is something about finding a home in somewhere you've never been. And if that sounds like a strange concept to you, I don't think you'll find it quite so perplexing after you meet today's guest, Sunday Taylor. She grew up in Pennsylvania and Connecticut and attended Bates College in Maine. She's a graduate of the Master of Arts program in English Literature at UCLA. She spent the last 4 decades in California and currently lives in LA. She's married with 2 grown daughters and 3 granddaughters, and she journeys to England every year, reads Jane Eyre every autumn, which is my favorite Brontë, and identifies as an Anglophile. This is her first book. We're going to talk about it today, The Anglophile's Notebook. Sunday Taylor, welcome to Mysterious Goings On.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
I'm excited. This is your first book, no?
It is. And I never expected to. I wanted to. My whole life, I've wanted to write a book. But I couldn't imagine it would actually happen. And then it just came to me one day, and I couldn't stop.
So let's we'll explore the book in a moment. I want to explore, though, this finding this other home, this place that you're so in love with, the British Isles. When did you first venture there, and when did you know that it held a special place in your heart?
It was when I was in college, and I was an English major, English literature, as you just mentioned, and every book I read, every poem, every essay was set in England. And when I was 21, I scrabbled together a little bit of money I could do, and I went to Europe. Back then, there was a book called Europe on $5 a Day. I did it. That's really dating me. But anyway, wow. I went, of course, to England first because I wanted to see where all these books were set. It was, it was living in my mind and imagination, all the settings and all the books I've been reading for like 6 years. I wanted to see where they were set. I wanted to see where the writers lived. I wanted to see where they ate, the pubs they drank in, all those blue plaques all over London that will tell you where Virginia Woolf lived and hosted her Bloomsbury, salons and Charles Dickens' house. So I was swept away at that young age by the literary quality of London and England. And because I've been a book lover my entire life, and particularly after college, to go and see it kind of come alive, what had only been in my imagination was thrilling. And then, of course, the great museums and the art. I was an art history minor and all that. And it just, to see all the great art in the fabulous places there. But it started then. And then I have to say that, over the years, I went a few times, but then I'd say the last 10 to 12 years, my husband and I, every time we thought of going to Europe, and he likes it too, which is good, we would go to England and then go some other place too. But so there's just so much to discover, and it just was something that spoke to me because I'm a literary kind of person, and it's just a magical place to be for a book lover. I've always felt that way. And you just starting with the bookstores, just the bookstores alone, because as we know in our country, bookstores are dying out. We have, like here in Los Angeles, in West Los Angeles, there's only one. It's a little bitty one, but it's always packed. But in England, and also some of our bookstores don't have maybe the greatest ambiance or atmosphere, whatever. Maybe there's a coffee bar and they're selling, teddy bears or whatever. But, those bookstores are really kind of spectacular and very splendid looking. For example, the first thing I do when I'm in London is I go to Hatchard's. I just make a beeline for Hatchard's, which is the oldest bookstore in London. I think it's 200 years old. And, it's on Piccadilly. Piccadilly is a madhouse with all the traffic and the horns beeping. But you duck into Hatchard's, and it's like you've escaped into this world of books, which I love, but also history. It's so beautiful and old looking, with, I think, 3 or 4 floors of books, and this beautifully carved wooden banister, and you just walk up, and there's a fireplace, and there's a portrait of the Queen, and I mean, it's just like the complete opposite of, like, Barnes and Noble, which I love, of course, but you know what I'm saying. It's just the bookstores alone pull me in. I spend a lot of time at them when I'm over there. So England, and just the castles and the countryside, it's so green and verdant, and you can just pretend that you're in another time period very easily in certain parts, not all parts, obviously. It's not like all idyllic, like I'm describing, but I just go to those places to feel good.
Well, I've been there, and I did a car journey from Scarborough to Blackpool, which is a magical memory of mine. Did it, of course, in the nearly brutal part of winter, but that's another story. But there's something about it. There is an atmosphere. But there's also, it's good for me to hear this about you, though, is that I'm thinking of it. There's one of my favorite films called Breaking Away, back from, I think, early 1980, 81. And it's about a kind of a lower middle class family in America. And the young man, he wants to be a bike racer, like Tour de France kind of thing. And he idolized the Italians. And so they had this race, and the Italians came. And he idolized them, right? And he finally met Italians, and they sabotage his bike, and so he goes to his room and rips down the posters, and he hates them and so I wonder, though, because I've seen this occasionally, and I've had my own experiences where you think, oh my gosh, it's going to be all of these things, and then you get there,
idealize it, right?
And then you have maybe not such a great experience, which I'm not going to go into too deeply here, but a relationship, that kind of things, and then it becomes to maybe a point of pain. So I'm just curious. It sounds like you've never had any kind of real disappointment with it.
I'm just there as a tourist. If I was living there, it probably would be very different. I'm just visiting probably a lot of places that maybe a native, they walk right. My thing just, my ear.
Yeah, they might just walk right past it and ignore it. And I saw a lot of that. Or if I'd said occasionally to a friend there, an English friend, I'd say, oh, I'm going to go to this place in London. Oh, that's so expensive. Why would you go there? And I'm like, because I don't live here and I want to see these things,
Well, I'll tell you a story. Now that you're reminding me of something, I went on this wonderful writer's retreat in Florence, like when I was writing the book. And there were people from Australia and, all over Europe, and some Americans, and there were 2 English women. And one night we were talking about, I don't know, I guess I must have been talking about what I was writing about. And I was like, just like I just came off to you, rapturous, about. And one of them said to me, please don't idealize our country. And I was like, whoa. That was like, I felt like kind of a kick in the stomach. I felt stupid. And I felt kind of like, wow, I must be sounding really ridiculous. But it was an interesting thing to say to me. And I realized I wouldn't have said it to somebody that was doing that about our country. I probably would have said something like, oh my God, well, you haven't obviously been here or there or whatever. But it was just, so I know what you're talking about. I know it's like you idealize it, but then if you really maybe get into it with some people that think you're idealizing it and they're not thrilled with that, they're going to let you know. And so that was not a happy moment, but it's okay.
Yeah, and that's the thing too about that culture too, and I mean, at least about English culture too. I always found them to be extraordinarily direct, and
that's right.
They will insult you with a smile on their face as a bit of a joke, And I knew someone who used to say, "Not being funny, but," and then I'd always say, "Yeah, that's amazing because you really aren't funny, are you?"
Oh yeah, just coming in backwards,
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Exactly. But Claire, though, the main character in your book, and I'm going, if you don't mind, I just want to just kind of give folks is that okay if I just read a little bit of the blurb, because I want people to understand what this is about.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Claire Easton is a writer and magazine editor living in Los Angeles. And she's married to a successful music producer, Ben Roden. As Ben is about to leave on a 3-month music tour in Australia, Claire travels to England to research a book on her favorite author, Charlotte Brontë, a love she inherited from her otherwise inattentive mother. While seeking Bronte's secrets, Claire discovers her own. The Anglophile's Notebook will whisk the reader away to literary London and the beautifully wild countryside of Yorkshire, home to the Brontë sisters, brimming with writerly ghosts, enchanting bookstores, cozy pubs, English country gardens, and memorable characters. This novel is for anyone who has found their imagination in the gardens of rural England or a 200-year-old bookstore in London, as you just said, and felt utterly alive. And that is the thing about this book. Claire is discovering so much, and it's a bit of a literary mystery. And I'd love it if you could tell our listeners what you mean by that. What is a literary mystery?
Sure. Oh, absolutely. She just a teeny bit to say about what happens is that like we said, well, I'll go back just a couple paces behind that. Is that I was interested at the time in people meeting each other online, virtually to begin with, like initially, and then through blogs, through websites, through Instagram now. I mean, people talk, on the comments, so back and forth, and DM and all that. And it was intriguing to me what would happen if they met in real life, like actually met in the flesh. Would they become friends? And it happened to me a few times with a couple women in London, one here in LA. And we've stayed friends. And so so my concept was to put my heroine on an airplane from LA to London to meet someone she's only known through that person's blog. And meeting this person is going to change her life. She doesn't know that. And she's at a crossroads in her life at this moment, with unresolved issues about her husband, her marriage, her mother who's just passed away, in her career. And so these things, unbeknownst to her, are going to all play out on this trip. Because when she gets there, she finds out her husband's been unfaithful, and there's nothing in LA for her to return to. So she is going to stay in London for an indefinite amount of time. And she wanders into a little bookstore early on and meets the bookstore owner, John Spencer, who has in his possession a manuscript that's signed CB that he believes is a rough draft of a short story written by a very young Charlotte Brontë. And he knows there's a letter from Charlotte's brother, Branwell, saying this is the case. The letter has gone missing. And they bond, she and John, immediately over the love of, I meant to say this, the love of books and the love of the Brontes. And so together they're going to start on this sort of literary adventure of a lifetime. And when I say literary mystery, so it's a mystery about a writer, a literary mystery about, did Charlotte Brontë really write this book, which would be a huge discovery. And I truly think, people have said to me, would that be possible today, that there be something out there that was never published? I believe it is, only because after she died, the possessions in that house, the Brontë parsonage and the manuscripts and so many things were sold. So much was sold. And by her husband, stuff was sold. It was unfortunate. So to this day, things come up at auction that haven't been seen for 100 years. They just wrote on the New York Times a big article about a trove of Brontë material, hasn't been seen for 100 years, that includes the handwritten manuscript of Emily Bronte's all of her poetry with pencil edits by Charlotte. That's going to go up for auction this month, and they think that particular, and a lot of other pieces too, but that particular manuscript is going to fetch $1.5 million. It's so rare. I mean, the manuscript for Wuthering Heights, that doesn't exist. So I did think this was somewhat believable that there could be something like this floating around. So that's what I meant by literary mystery. They're going to see, first off, if they can find this letter from the brother, Branwell, and then that will be the key, to putting them on the road to prove that it's by her.
I love this, how you do that. I do this in my own work, weaving in, actual historical events and people into your story here, and I love that. So Charlotte died at 38, very young, right?
She did. That's right. Yeah.
Is either typhoid or TB or both, or I'm not
Well,
sure.
what's no, she it's funny. You know, she outlived all of her siblings, and it was just her and her father in the end. And then she did marry 8 months before her death. She was pregnant, and she died of morning sickness, extreme, like
Oh,
Kate Middleton
wow.
had, who had to be hospitalized for it. But back then there was, no treatment, and her little body couldn't withstand it. It was just all day long. She was sick all day long, and she died of dehydration. She might have also had tuberculosis at that point, but the thing that killed her was this, that disease that they knew nothing about at the time. So yeah,
Incredibly tragic.
she outlived all of them, and actually had become quite famous at that point. For the like 7 years of fame, I guess, or something like that. Her book came out in 1847, Jane Eyre, and then she wrote a couple books after that. But yeah,
Yeah.
she died at 38.
Jane Eyre is the one that sticks with me. And just as an aside, I don't know if you ever read the prequel that was done by another author in the '60s, Wide Sargasso Sea.
I have
Just
not read that book, and I've got to read that book. I have
Sunday,
not read it.
you must. It's just
I
great.
can't
I
believe I
was
haven't. I'm embarrassed to say I haven't read it.
Well, the only reason I can admit this thing is that I initially in grad school was an English major for about a semester, and we read it, and it was just it blew my mind. It was so wonderful. But back to the book. So I'd love to ask you though about the writing of the book. It's your first book. Curious as to whether or not you discovered who you are as a writer writing this, in the sense of this is my process, this is what I do. Maybe you went into it one way and came out the other end doing the other. The reason I ask that is because it's your first book, and we oftentimes don't get to
Yeah.
speak to somebody about their debut novel. So I'd love to know
Mhm.
just all about that.
It was very organic. I mean, I got the idea, it was about 5 years ago, and I raced into this room and I started typing like in a frenzy. And then, I thought, this is interesting because um, I have loved books and travel and women writers in England for most of my life. And um, I just realized if I could tell a story that those elements might from me would feed into and make it an interesting story about a woman who goes to England to research a book on Charlotte Brontë and whose life is utterly transformed by the experience, maybe I was onto something. But, I didn't always have those kind of days, and it was, tedious and looking at a blank page and all that stuff. But it did happen, and it was so thrilling to get the ideas when they would come to me. But it was organic. I didn't have any outline. I had no idea where it was going. I just knew this woman's life was going to be changed because a lot of mysteries in her life, her relationship with her mother, and lots of other things were going to be clarified by this journey she goes on. But I didn't have it all worked out, and characters just appeared. Or it was just amazing, and it was thrilling, exciting. I have to say, I loved writing. I loved writing this book. I hope I have it in me to do another book, but I loved the experience. But I had, while I wrote, I compiled a notebook because I'd been tearing out pages from newspapers, magazines, most of my life on all the topics that appealed to me. I started putting them in the notebook, and I had lots of stuff about the Brontes, but I had to figure out, what are these houses going to look like? What are the gardens going to look like? And I was clipping all those pages, and I had them filed, London houses, English gardens, and it turned out that these visual prompts, because there were a lot of photos, really helped me with the writing. And I had to figure out what kind of flowers would this renowned horticulturist woman in the Cotswolds grow in her garden, or what would a Notting Hill, house of a renowned interior designer look like? And so I was really helped by the visual prompts, but they also gave me ideas. I remember I cut out a picture of somebody was talking about in one of the magazines that if her house ever burned down, she would always take the letters that her father wrote, the love letters her father wrote her mother, and they were beautifully, these vintage, brownish kind of letters tied up with a red claret, beautiful ribbon. And that spurred me on to write the part of the story where Claire discovers the love letters, the letters written to her mother by a mysterious Englishman, which starts to solve a lot of her questions about her life. But so that notebook was very helpful, and it became like a commonplace book, like a book, like, you know, those old-fashioned, like a repository of knowledge that you've been collecting through your life, quotes and articles and photos and essays and things on your favorite writers. And that book was hugely instrumental. I put a picture of Charlotte Brontë on the front, and then I would really just, when I was at a loss, just go through it, and I would figure, I'd sometimes get an idea for a new character, new plot line. And I really started noticing my books that I was reading all my life, and what were the kind of books that I liked to read. And I started realizing what they were, and I should probably write a book that I would like to read that maybe resembled the books that I like to read. So, you know, I've said to people, notice the books, notice your books, because it's going to help you maybe figure out what you want to write, because you probably want to write what you want to read. And also I got a lot of feedback from friends along the way. I mean, they really, but only gave it to people who were like kindred spirits, where we thought sort of the same way, because you have to be careful with that. And that was a good piece of advice I got, to just, you know, like-minded friends who would kind of get your vision and share it and maybe help you express it better. And so I was lucky. So a lot of that, but I mean, I just came into this room and just wrote every single day. And then, you know, at that point, I had a little bit of a tip from someone in my life who turned me on to a publisher, a small indie publisher. And it was known that one of them loved the Brontes. And so we thought that might resonate, and I pitched it, and they wanted to read it. And they accepted it, you know, with the caveat that I, you know, work with an editor to make it better, which I did. And that was, you know, I really enjoyed that, because we both loved the Brontes. So we were able to, you know, connect on that, and she helped me with a lot of stuff. But yeah, my first book, and I was really one of the most exciting 5 years of my life.
Now, was it Haworth? Is that where they're from, the Brontes, or
Haworth? Yeah, Haworth. Right.
Now,
up in the north, you know.
And you visited there, correct?
I did, and that was really good. That was part of the research for the book. That helped me a lot.
Just walking those streets and absorbing that.
Yeah, because they haven't changed. I mean, really, you walk up that main street, and everything looks, you could just imagine the Bronte sisters walking down that cobblestone street and mailing off their manuscripts at the post office. And the post office isn't there anymore, but the counter of the post office still exists. And it's in, I think it's card shops. They have it there. So that's really history, where they actually handed to, you know, the postmistress, whatever it was called, their manuscript all tied up and ready to be sent off. It's really worth it. It's fun to go there if you're interested in the Brontes.
I think I shall next time we go. And of course, they mailed them off under their pen names, their assumed names.
Under their male pseudonyms. Yeah, smart. Yeah. Very smart, because it was considered vulgar for women to be writers at the time. It was just ridiculous. I mean, you know, they had, and really their opportunities, either they're going to be a governess or a teacher, and they didn't like, the three of them tried it all, and they didn't like any of those things. And so writing was their only hope. And really and truly, it's sad to think how soon Anne and Emily died after their books came out. But Charlotte did get to live for quite a few years afterwards.
And this may be an unfair question, but I love it if you would speculate. What's your opinion? What do you think was about them? What was different about them? Or is it just that there were lots of women like them, but they happened to do something that survived the ages by writing? I mean, was there something different about them?
Mm-hmm. Very different. They wrote books that were different than other women wrote. They included male characters that were like Byronic, mad, bad, and dangerous to know. And
Rochester.
women were not writing like that about men, particularly. There are probably some, but these books were passionate, dramatic. I mean, Wuthering Heights and Jane Eyre is just such a gothic thriller. And Anne's book, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, is about an alcoholic husband. And so, the books were really popular because they were thrilling. And then when the world found out, the writers were these three shy, retiring spinsters that lived in this remote part of England in a parsonage surrounded by a cemetery on three sides. They were impoverished. They rode against so many obstacles. People really were fascinated. And that's when the trek of the after Charlotte died, and Elizabeth Gaskell wrote her biography about Charlotte, it was just a never-ending stream of people wanting to see, where did this all happen? Where did these three women live? And how unlikely that they wrote these books. So, and what about the idea of three sisters? I read something, somebody had said this, I think it was Tracy Chevalier, had written about the Brontes, and she said, just the sheer improbability of what they accomplished. She said, imagine your siblings, that you all wrote books in the same year, and then 200 years later, they were considered classics. It's just so improbable. And, against the odds, too, that women writers would be so successful. But like I said, they had to pretend to be males to get anywhere.
And what about Branwell? What's his story?
Oh, he was such failure. Sadly, he was a failure at everything he tried. He tried to be a painter, and he took the very expensive art lessons. I think he was sent to London for those lessons, and he, I don't think he was instructed properly, and he was, there's the famous portrait, the only existing portrait of the three sisters in the National Portrait Gallery. I go to it every single time I'm in London, that Branwell painted, and it's amateurish. And in fact, he was in it originally, and he erased so there's like a white pillar in the middle where he would have been. But he always had, I think, grand illusions of who he should be, and he should have been, a famous writer, but he couldn't stick with stuff. And he was an alcoholic. So those sisters watched him just descend further and further into alcoholism. And I guess he died from it. So like in 1845, he died, and they were just about to publish their books, or they were writing their books. It was just like such a critical time in everybody's lives. And then some goodness happened with, their books being published. So they are famous because they were different. They really were different. And it's just the oddity of who they were and where they lived and what they accomplished.
It's strange that they live in this, as you said, this fairly bucolic place, and I think I read something that two of them went eventually to meet the publishers and prove they were who they said they were. They had the letters, and they were dressed kind of not so great, and they were kind of country bumpkin-y, right?
That's right. They were.
But the publisher kind of made them the toast of the town while they were there with him, and he's just like, oh my gosh. So I think that's fascinating. But speaking of publishing, I'm curious, Sunday Taylor, what will we see next from you, if anything?
I would love to write another book. I seem to be moving towards setting it in England again, but I don't know. I have two sisters, and I have one of them in love with the wrong person, and it's very much in its infancy. I hope it goes someplace, but I'm kind of at a writer's block at this point. But I want to write another book, definitely.
Did you find the lockdown time being helpful or a hindrance to writing? I myself, I hate to admit it, I couldn't focus. I had little to do, but very little focus.
I was editing then, so it was easier. I wasn't having to be so creative at that point. So I was glad to have something to do that was positive.
Yeah.
But it was a hard time. I could barely read any books. And I also was so busy with my own book, but I just found it was interesting. My reading habits changed.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I had trouble concentrating on, I'm in a couple book clubs, and I was just not a very good book club member, but I did have the excuse I was working on my book. Yeah, I just think something happened to me with my attention, during the pandemic that I think I'm getting back now, reading some good books.
Yeah, me too. Same. I got a huge stack, well, as you can see behind me. Just this shelf here is just books for the podcast. And so I've got plenty to read, but I don't know. I chide myself, but then I had a buddy who said, get off your own back. No, it's not like you're the only person in the world who had a little issue during lockdown. So, Sunday, if folks want to buy this wonderful book, where can they find it?
Well, I think they can go on my website, which is sundaytaylor.com, and learn a little bit more about the book, and then they can push, it's available on Amazon. Bookstores do carry it, but probably the best is to go on my website.
sundaytaylor.com. And by the way, when you go there, folks, you get to learn a little more about our own Sunday Taylor, but you also get some wonderful excerpts from reviews that are just stunning. And I'm just here to tell you, I'm holding this hardback copy as we speak. It's got a lovely dust cover. It's very well put together. This is a fantastic first book. I'm a tad envious, but I'm also thrilled that I got to meet Sunday Taylor and learn more about it and read this wonderful book. Sunday, thank you so much for joining us here on Mysterious Goings On.
I so appreciate you having me on, and I love talking with you. Thank you so much.
Okay, who has a podcast, then writes an ebook about podcasting and doesn't do an audiobook version of it? Well, not me. I've done that. In fact, I'm very excited to tell you, dear listeners, that the podcast option, my recent top-selling ebook on podcasting, my journey through 15 years as a podcaster, broadcaster, host, guest, and observer, is now an Audible audiobook. It's really, really, really exciting for me to be able to present this to you through Audible, which is available on Amazon.com, where the ebook link is as well. And in this fast listen, my experience comes to you through stories, practical tips, and advice from my hundreds of hours as a guest, producer, podcast host, and more. And the podcast option, if I say so myself, is mandatory listening for those new to podcasting, and it should be a welcome addition to veteran podcasters' libraries. So check out the podcast option read by yours truly, Alex Greenwood, or as they say there, the J. Alexander Greenwood, because that's my pen name, and that's a long story, which if you dig through my podcast, eventually you'll find out what that means. But the point being today, the podcast option is available now as an Audible audiobook. I've got a link in the show notes to make it easy for you. Please do me a favor, go get that audiobook. Or if audiobooks aren't your bag, there's also a link for you to get it as an ebook. Again, the podcast option. I certainly hope you will choose it. Thanks so much for listening to Mysterious Goings On. Don't forget, we have a complete archive of all of our interviews, monologues, updates, live readings, dead readings. All of that stuff is available at mgopod.com. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to us so you never miss an episode. We're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all the usual suspects. Please join us there. Again, don't forget, mgopod.com also has links where to find me on social media and how to get in touch in case you want to be a guest here on the show. Well, I think it's time that I move on for this week, but until next time, keep reading.